Well, hello everyone. Something a little bit different today. I've got an interview lined up for you with a good buddy of mine, Mike, the editor at Imperium Press, who have such brilliant books on the market as The Populist Illusion. But they have a new book out which really caught my eye. And I'm really glad that you've brought this out because I remember about 6 months back, somebody asked me what should Imperium bring out. And I said, well, there's this little known book by Giantano Mosca called What is Mafia or What is the Mafia? Um, and well, they've gone and done it. They've brought out What is the Mafia by the Godfather of elite theory, Mosca himself. And I was actually surprised and pleased to learn that you've uncovered another work that I didn't even know existed, which is called, what's the name of it, Mike? It's
It's called
Men
Men
and
and
Things of
Things
Sicily.
of
Yeah,
Sicily.
Men and Things of Sicily. So, I mean, just before we get going here, I mean, hopefully most of the audience have read Populist Illusion and have some idea who Mosca is. So we don't need to go into the ins and outs of, you know, Elite Theory 101. We'll assume that the audience knows, you know, about the disorganized mass, the disorganized minority against the organized minority against the disorganized mass, which I call Mosca's law, and all of the other things that Mosca talks about in his classic, The Ruling Class. Um, but what can you tell me about this book? What is the Mafia, and what kind of got you interested in bringing this one out?
Well, I've been thinking along these lines for quite a while now. Well, I guess I'll explain it first before I go into that. What is the Mafia is it's not really a book length. It's I think from memory it's about 10,000 words or so. So it's like a pamphlet where what Moscow is trying to do here is he's clearly, because he is himself at this time a liberal, was a liberal all his life, but he was a realist liberal, right? He was one that understood power, one of the first and most insightful um, elite theorists. And he basically applies elite theory to the mafia because he himself was a Sicilian, and so he was ethnically of the people from whom the mafia came, but he was spiritually or philosophically he was more aligned with the Italians in the north, and you know what I mean. Like he was just basically an urbanite and an academic and scholar, right? So he was kind of that class, but he understood on the ground how the mafia worked. And at the time when he was writing, which is I think exactly the year 1900, the mafia it had been a problem for quite a while for Italy because basically what it was is it was a little in the Juvenalian terminology, a little rival castle. It was a little node of what we might call para sovereignty that existed within Italian society, played by its own rules, didn't really observe the sovereign authority of the state, and this was a bit of a problem. And of course, Mosca has objections to it on a moral level as well as on a practical level. So, what the book here, what is the Mafia? This little pamphlet that he wrote, it was basically aimed at other Italian elites to explain how the mafia works, what it is in its essence, and basically how to get rid of it. Because for them, it was this problem basically. So that's essentially what the book is about. And how I kind of got onto it is I've been thinking for quite a long time now about the devolution of sovereignty in the modern age. Um, you can see this in many other countries, both currently and historically. You could think historically of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the long story short with that, basically the Russian mafia essentially integrated itself with the state and became the state. So that's a very extreme example of devolution and reconstitution of sovereignty through these rival authorities. And you could think of the Mexican drug cartels right now. Basically, there's a war being waged over sovereignty in Mexico right now. So this is something that's happening all across the world, and I believe it's going to start happening in the West because of the instability and the inability of the sovereign center in places like the UK, especially places like Canada, and to some extent perhaps in the United States, the inability of the sovereign center to assert its authority on the ground. You could think of any number of examples of this. This is going to start becoming a reality for us. And so I've been thinking about this, these para-sovereigns, organized crime, or what the state might call terrorists. Uh, these are going to start to become more and more able to assert local authority. And this book is absolutely perfect for framing that analysis, because basically it's Mosca doing the same thing 125 years ago. So it's very interesting. And he's doing it at a time when the state was weak because it was young, right? Because at the time, the Risorgimento had kind of only recently happened. Italian unification was only had happened within the last generation or two. So the Italian state was young. It was weak because it's young, but in the West, the state is weak because it's old. So I believe that we are actually heading towards a situation that is closer to what Mosca had in mind than we are right now. So I think that this book is
Yeah,
very timely.
I tried to kind of give some applied examples from now. In this country, there was a very famous or infamous, I should say, example featuring our current Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who basically her constituency has a lot of Muslims in it, and there's this video of her basically kind of having to go and kind of confront the local imams, right? Basically, the community chieftain or the community godfather, you could say, where it's like, I mean, in theory, she's a very powerful woman, Angela Rayner, the second most powerful person in the country, legalistically, as the deputy prime minister. But if you watch that footage and look at the power dynamics in the room, you can tell she's terrified. You can tell that she's in a room with a group of men who operate much like a mafia. Another example, thinking a little bit more outside the box, Mike, is all the stuff with like Jeffrey Epstein and that whole network in America. There's clearly a kind of mafia-like operation that operates even within the nodes of power that seems to supersede the official power in some places, and that seems to have come very much into focus recently as well. Um, but just before we carry on, we should probably lay out that I mean, okay, Moscow is a liberal. Moscow certainly would prefer the state to have authority or the official judiciary to have authority over the mafia, but he does not treat it as just like a purely criminal activity, does he? He basically says like this is the mafia power structure is like a state within a state, and I mean, he basically gives us applied elite theory. And what struck me reading his kind of description of how the mafia operates is that it really does feel like a political party or any kind of official state power structure. Like, for example, he talks about clients. He talks about how the mafia secures loyalty through patronage and favors. Well, how's that any different from a political party basically buying support through Gibbs? It's exactly the same. Um, he talks about the mutual obligations between I mean, he phrases it as the powerless clients, with the mafia as a kind of go between where people have lost trust in the official state. So yeah, well, I mean, what can you say about Moscow's general description of how the mafia operates?
Well, it's pretty interesting because he is giving as much of a value-free analysis as he possibly can. I think in this work, he is his priors shine through a little bit more than they do in the ruling class, where he is like he's framing it in such a way as that this is a social pathology that needs to be gotten rid of, and here's how to understand it. Here's the sort of spiritual basis for it in a way. Here's what makes it tick, and if we understand that, then we can kind of understand how to get rid of it. But it's very interesting because he gives an analysis which basically frames it as a kind of alternate sovereign. So where sovereignty is weak, as it was in rural Sicily, not everywhere in Sicily, certainly in rural Sicily, um, at the turn of the 20th century, it's like this. It's interesting because the mafia performs many of the traditional functions of the state, right? It's able to levy taxes in terms of demanding bribes. Basically, it's able to enforce its own law via violence. It's able to mediate disputes. It's even able to provide things like welfare and social services and employment and things like that. So it really does act as a traditional sovereign, but in such a way as it's essentially a competitor with the centralized state. And this is the problem, right? Mosca wants to underline this, that this is how it works, and there are certain things, certain we might call say material conditions that make it so in Sicily. Some of it has to do with historical things like the last regime that sort of was holding power before the Risorgimento and all that. It's also somewhat to do with the economic backwardness and the lack of education and things like that. So he wants us to understand exactly how it works and what functions it performs. And if we can understand these, so it goes in his analysis, then we can change what needs to be changed in order to basically get rid of it. And it's very interesting because they were successful. Actually, Italy was quite successful. I don't think it's not because they listened to Mosca, right? Because parliamentary democracy is basically just a kind of like a chicken coop of clucking voices back and forth. It kind of doesn't go anywhere, right? The thing that got rid of it was Italian fascism, ultimately. And I think that there is one essay at the very end of the second section, "The Men and Things of Sicily," that it goes into Italian fascism, because that was later than he was writing most of these essays. But basically, it took a overtly centralized authority to basically stamp out these rival castles. Very interestingly, what happens after that is that in the mop-up effort, when the U.S. and allied forces come in and basically defeat Italian fascism, they actually deputize the mafia to kind of rule in the aftermath, which is very interesting from a Juvenalian perspective. But anyway, going back to the mafia analysis here, it's basically an early sociological analysis of organized crime as a para-state, or you might say a parallel sovereignty. The mafia is not just a criminal organization, it's a social institution, right? It's deeply embedded in Sicilian life. And Mosca wants to emphasize the absence of state authority in rural Sicily, which the void of which is filled by the mafia, right? It behaves like a private system of arbitration and protection. It performs traditional state functions like security and justice and retribution and all of that.
Yeah, and I mean,
So,
there was a line that you that is quoted in the introduction, Mike. That a passage that is quoted quite early on that kind of caught my eye, because I'll tell you what it reminded me of. So Mosca writes, the term mafia describes the attitude of those who believe that turning to the established authorities in cases of persecution by private enemies shows weakness of character and almost cowardice. Okay. What it reminded me of, remember, I come from a libertarian background. So I've read like tons of nutty kind of anarcho-capitalist kind of fantasies, Hans Hermann Hoppe and Milton Friedman's son, David Friedman, and how a private society would work and all of that. And it really did remind me of that kind of I mean, I guess what you call it, like neo-feudalist Hans Hermann Hoppe kind of style libertarianism, due to the emphasis on private justice and the absolute distrust of the state. And I was kind of caught between thinking, like, there's a part of me that thinks it's kind of like quote unquote based, and there was a part of me that thinks, like, yeah, I can see why, if you want a stable society or if you want Italy to be a great country, this is a problem. So I could kind of see Mosca's point. and I can see the point of view of the state as well. But there's part of me that's thinking like, because in a way, a lot of us have found ourselves in this same scenario where it's like, well, can we trust the state to arbitrate in these matters of private justice? Where you've got these kind of horrible, quote unquote, like quasi private groups, for example, that will dox and harass and tell outright lies about you, and then you think, well, okay, well, I want to go about this through legal means, blah 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 blah. But then there's like a part of you that thinks like, well, hold on a second, this maybe this whole structure is hostile to me. Um, so I kind of like you understand what I'm saying, right? I was kind of like caught in two minds between thinking like I can kind of understand the mindset, the mafia mindset, um,
Yeah.
and I couldn't like figure out like is this a good idea or a bad idea or what? What are you thinking?
Well, I mean, my thought on the matter is good or bad idea. This is the future, right? This is what's happening, and it's very interesting that you mentioned Hoppe and the sort of anarcho-capitalist side of things, because you're right. It does resemble that in some ways. It actually reminds me a lot of Carl Ludwig von Haller's restoration of political science, where he's sort of like the counter enlightenment era version of Hoppe, where he's basically
Yeah,
saying that sovereignty is essentially independence, and all sovereignty grows out of the personal power of the man who can just assert authority within his local canton or whatever. But where I think Mosca, or where the analysis here, and certainly the analysis in the dissident right, differs, is that whereas anarcho-capitalists and libertarians want to do away with the state, what Mosca is kind of, what you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit to get this out of what he's saying, but it's very clear, is that um, you can never get rid of the state. It's just the state is reconstituted at a different level. Chris Bond, the guy who wrote Nemesis all those years ago, had a good phrase that he used, which is sovereignty is conserved, right? You can think of a conservation law
hmm,
of like matter and energy, like matter can never be created nor destroyed, right? You could say the same thing about sovereignty. And just as matter or energy is never destroyed, but it's transformed, sovereignty is the same. It's just reallocated or absorbed or recomposed at a different level. It flows wherever organization or cohesion and authority persist. It doesn't
yeah,
vanish because
and
someone always rules. It's just a question of who.
yeah, I mean, and this is ultimately why I could never become an anarcho-capitalist. In fact, I remember arguing with libertarians years ago. I mean, I'm talking like 7, 8 years ago. I did a stream called, thinking out what the private society would look like, and I had this character called the Car King, right, where you get this local magnate, a tycoon, who basically ends up reproducing the state in his little car town, and basically ends up being the de facto king with feudal peasants and slaves and so on and so forth, with a justice system around him. And ultimately, I was like, well, look, you're back to square one because you've just made the state again. Um, and if you think about it, Mafia is basically that. It comes through. Sorry, I mean, I put Godfather in the on the cover of this video, but I think it comes through very strongly if you watch The Godfather, the original one. That the Godfather, Vito Corleone, is basically a king with feudal kind of vassals and peasantry and a sense of noblesse oblige, and it really is like a state within a state, of which he is the executive, the monarch, the prince, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very pertinent because, like, The Godfather is basically showing what happens when the authority of the state is unable to sort of penetrate into certain social spaces. What happens? Well, it's not anarchy, it is order or sovereignty that's asserted at a different level. And I think this is really pertinent right now because as things get worse, and the state becomes more and more tyrannical and pathological and just outright hostile to the people that it rules over, And as things get worse and worse in different ways, economically, in terms of geopolitics, like it looks like the imperial center can't even win wars against its rivals anymore. It's like what seems to be happening is that people are looking towards a collapse. The collapse narrative is starting to really gain steam, and there's some good reasons for that. But I think what this analysis that Mosca gives us here, and that you can even read out of the Godfather in some ways, is it's that there's not going to be a collapse. It's going to be a reordering, right? It's a reconfiguration. So the collapsitarians kind of anticipate this hard, like, downgrade of Western state systems, a Mad Max situation. More likely, what's going to happen is a gradual devolution. You're going to answer to more and more local authorities. Authority is going to become more fragmented. Authority structures are going to be reordered. National cohesion is going to weaken, and local and parallel powers are going to come in to fill the void. So this is not anarchy. This is not Mad Max. It's looking more like the devolution that happened, and it may be cliche to say, but in the aftermath of the collapse of the Roman Empire, because that wasn't a Mad Max situation either. All that happened was the provincial governor that you once answered to, well, it was more like the local strongman, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So this is kind of what's going to
and
happen.
in fact, sorry to interrupt, Mike, but Mosca does actually discuss this process further in the ruling class, where his name for it is the tendency towards feudalization. So you have a massive tendency towards bureaucracy getting larger and larger, centralization, the state getting bigger and bigger. But then at a certain size and unwieldiness and point of decline, you then start getting what he calls a tendency towards feudalization. This is also discussed by Robert Michels as well, which I discuss all of this in Populist Illusion. So it's interesting that this idea in embryonic form is in this Mafia book.
Absolutely. It's really a case study of, it's like applied elite theory, right? Where what he describes, well, actually, what he describes is something that's already happened, but we're kind of on the other side of that, where the Italy of the year 1900 was kind of moving away from that, able to kind of stamp it out. We're in a situation where it's growing, and it's only going to continue to grow. And ultimately, what it is, it's not collapse; it's elite circulation, right? The process is not the death of the ruling class, but a rotation of the ruling class, where new elites rise from the criminal or the tribal or the corporate periphery,
Mhm.
and elites adapt by incorporating them and legitimizing them. And some very interesting things have happened in the 20th century. I think guys really need to understand what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. That is a great case study of like how this could happen in a very dramatic way, right? Because when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Communist Party's ideological monopoly and administrative control basically ends. The state loses ability to enforce law, pay salaries, and control regional governors, and so on and so forth. There was a power vacuum that was filled basically by KGB holdovers, red directors, and criminal groups, right? So the state coercion apparatus didn't go away. It was just recolonized, essentially, right? So this was itself an elite circulation. And what happened over the course of basically the 90s and the 2000s is that the KGB and the oligarchs basically became the security state. The party managers became regional bosses. Criminals sort of infiltrated their way into the state, and Putin essentially consolidated sovereignty that way, right? So basically, what happened was you saw a full uh, absorption of the criminal element of the Russian mafia into the state, which became itself a kind of legitimized force. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen in our countries, but this is an example of what can happen in a compressed and accelerated environment, where you see this sovereign authority go away, what happens is feudal structures and come in to sort of shore things up and put a floor underneath what could have been a headlong collapse. And by feudal structures, all we mean is basically local bosses and local authority and personal authority over ideological or impersonal authority.
Mhm.
So this is kind of what's going on in Mosca's analysis in this book, and I think it's something we absolutely need to understand.
Yeah, I mean, one feature of the analysis, just before we wrap up, is the complicity of the elite in all of this. Mosca says, like, one of the only reasons the system is able to persist is because it's baked in. It's because the ruling class kind of, as a matter of convenience, lets it go, or is willing to work with it, or they're actually part of it. And one of the things that struck me is that in leftist politics, in, for example, the Democrat Party in America or in the Labour Party here, a lot of this stuff is baked in when we get to the ethnic communities. I mean, I did a video a couple of months back on how the Islamic networks work hand in glove with the Labour Party, because there's basically a kind of Labour outsource the running of certain areas to these local chieftains, or these tribal leaders, in exchange for block votes, right? And it's basically accepted within Labour that these kind of ethnic enclaves don't work the same as normal politics everywhere else. They work on a kind of block basis, and I'm pretty sure they do that all over America as well, with various different ethnic groups. Probably it goes on in Australia too, I'd imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there has been some very interesting things that have come to light with now Australia is probably in better shape than either the UK or America in this way, but certainly in things like securing government contracts and whatnot, there's definitely integration between the state and biker gangs and things like that. The public private distinction is very gray. Like there is no real distinction. There's just a kind of continuum that runs between one and the other. And this the way that this works is best described really as a kind of feudal um, operation or feudal arrangement, right? And all that really means is that there is a sort of hierarchy of personal loyalties starting from the top and going all the way down, where the king, I mean the king or the local lord, he's a busy guy. He doesn't have time to micromanage everything that's going on at the local level. You're not going to go to him directly if you get a speeding ticket or anything like that. He's got things to do, right? So he kind of deputizes his under bosses, if we're going to use mafia terms, to this is your little parcel of land. These are your serfs. You manage it, right? You just do what you want, but just pay me a certain amount and acknowledge my sovereignty, and we're good to go, right? As a kind of mutual obligation between them, and it's a personal obligation. It's got nothing to do with ideology. It's got nothing to do with like national identity or anything at all like that. It's all local identity all the way down. It kind of works in this nested tree structure. There's a reason why feudalism has existed the world over at many, many different times and places, and it continues to exist, and it will always exist. It's because that is the best way to organize. That's the best way to basically run a system in a chaotic environment. And liberalism has been the beneficiary of a kind of quite orderly arrangement for quite a while, certainly at least since the the post World War II era, and ultimately from the post Westphalian system, things have been fairly orderly. But because of this, and because of the globalist sort of entropic move towards borderless worlds and everybody sort of living next to everybody else in ways that don't make any real ethnic sense, we have been thrust into this more chaotic world, and now this feudal structure is starting to make a lot more sense on the ground. So I think it's coming back, and I think that we have to come to grips with that, and Mosca gives us the tools for that. So it's very timely.
So, Mike, where can people get the book?
So if you go to imperiumpress.org, you will surely see it, I think, on our bestsellers list, or in the new releases, certainly. It's Gaetano Mosca's What is the Mafia? It's been introduced by myself. So some of what we talked about here, you'll be able to read a little bit about that, framing as the introduction and everything like that. So go check that out. We've got lots of good stuff there along these same lines. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike. Certainly, people should pick up What is the Mafia. Have you got anything else going on? Are you still doing Culture Dads and
Oh yes,
Substack and so
yes.
on? You should
Culture
probably tell
Dads
people.
goes from strength to strength. We're doing it every single week, and we have been for years now. Check out hearthfireradio.com. We've built ourselves basically a podcast platform. So this is not exactly, it's not a social media platform, but it's kind of like a based podcast Netflix, I suppose you could say, right? We've got a lot of content on there. We've got Tom Rousel from Survive the Jive. We got Marcus Folan, the Golden One. We got Paul Wagoner. We've got Dave doing his Heathen podcast, The Bog. We've got I'm doing a solo podcast on there. We've just got a lot going on. So hearthfireradio.com. If you like this kind of stuff that we're talking about, tribalism and all of that, you're going to get a lot of that on Hearthfire. And, you know, it helps to support a rival castle, I suppose, because we've built our own platform to get away from, you know, YouTube and all these major platforms. So this is one that we control, and there is no censorship. So there you go.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Mike. I will remind people it is absolutely boiling here, by the way. I'm sitting here sweating, Mike, because it's over, well, we're suffering a heat wave here. So it's over 30 degrees Celsius. I don't know about in Australia, but in this country, if it gets over, I actually bought an air conditioning unit yesterday.
That's like a Brit fall day here, basically.
Well, you don't forget it's the humidity and the fact that most places don't have AC, you know. But I bought one yesterday. I actually bought an AC, which means I need to sell even more courses. Promo code Scorcher. So you, yeah, pick that up as well as Mosca's What is the Mafia? It's the Academic Agency Summer Sale. Use the promo code Scorcher. 25% off all courses. Scorcher. Get it now. Scorcher. 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 Promo code Scorcher. 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 Buy it now. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. You can join the channel for thousands of hours of past shows in the archive and hundreds of videos. If you have any questions, you can leave a super chat or a super thanks, and I'll be sure to pick it up during my weekly office hours, which run every Tuesday afternoon. I also provide courses at the Academic Agency, which I encourage people to buy. Thousands of students now have taken the Trivium to improve their skills in writing, logic, and rhetoric. Just 3 of many courses available. Buy it now. But most importantly of all, friends, get out.